Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today here at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. My name is Asmaret, and I'm the Associate Deputy Director of the Center. Today's lecture is entitled A Readout of COP27, Implications for Global Climate Efforts. As many of you know, the annual UN Climate Change Conference, known as the Conference of Parties, or COP, took place from November 6th through the 20th in Egypt. So we're excited to have our speaker, Alice Hill, here with us today to help us to make sense of it all. So Alice is a senior fellow for energy and the environment at the Council on Foreign Relations. Alice previously served as a special assistant to President Barack Obama and was also the senior director for resilience policy on the National Security Council staff at the White House, where she led the development of national policy on climate change and biological threats. Prior to that, she was a research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, and during that time, she was awarded the National Institute of Building Sciences President's Award. So given that we're fresh off the heels of COP27, we decided to format this lecture differently from past CGSR lectures and engage in a virtual fireside chat. So as moderator, I'll ask Alice a series of questions, and after that, I'll open the floor to the audience for your questions. So please feel free to raise your virtual hand at that time to join in the discussion and ask a question, or you can type your question into the chat. So before we get started, I'd like to welcome Alice to the program. Alice, welcome to CGSR. Thank you for taking time out of your day to chat with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's really my pleasure and honor. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, so the first question. So before we dive into COP27, can you help set the scene for listeners who are new to the topic and talk about last year's COP? So what were the major outcomes of COP26?
Well, COP26 was the 26th Conference of the Parties, and that's the mechanism where nations, virtually all nations, it's 197, Yemen, Libya, and a few others are not members of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and that's was reached in the early 90s. And pursuant to that, nations gather every year. We did skip 1 year because of COVID, but the 26th COP occurred in Glasgow last year. And parties met there to come forward with how they were doing with the Paris Agreement, which was reached under this framework in 2015. It established a voluntary means for nations to come together to share how they are cutting their harmful greenhouse gas emissions. Harmful greenhouse gas emissions are forming essentially a blanket around the globe that is trapping heat and causing global average temperatures to rise. And with the rise in those temperatures come wildfires, extreme flooding, where so much rain falls at once. It's called a rain bomb. There's no place for that water to go, so there's flooding, extreme heat events that we've seen across the globe this summer, worsened drought, wildfires, as well as sea level rise. And then there are cascading events from those events. So nations have come together and say, we need to stop this. There's under an advisory group to the convention called the International Panel on Climate Change. Scientists come together every 4 or so years and do peer-reviewed articles, review all the peer-reviewed articles in climate science, and come to consensus about the state of the science. And those scientists, through the IPCC process, have been warning that we have to stop human-caused greenhouse gas emissions to bring down temperatures. So nations keep meeting to figure out how they're going to do that. And under the Paris Agreement, it's a voluntary commitment. At Glasgow, nations came forward, but it wasn't enough. Already, it was clear that we were going to, in all likelihood, blow past the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, aspirational goal that was set in 2015 in Paris. So leaving last year's meeting, the goal at COP27, which, as you've said, just occurred in Egypt, was to bring greater ambition to that meeting. In fact, in the Glasgow Compact, which was reached after the Glasgow meeting, nations explicitly said, we're going to bring forward more ambition next year and get on the problem of cutting emissions. Unfortunately, that really didn't quite happen as anticipated. United States, of course, with its Inflation Reduction Act, has brought forth significant promises, but there aren't enough promises to keep any assurance that we will be able to hold to the 1.5 degree rise. In fact, the World Meteorological Organization has said that within the next 5 years, there's a good chance we will, 50% chance that we will breach that 1.5, not on a sustained basis, but breach that limit. Right now, based on the commitments that have been made to date, it looks like we will exceed by 2100. The world will global average temperature rise of 2, probably closer to the high end of 2. And that brings dire consequences. The group of scientists, their consensus reports, have stated that if we breach the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, it can cause irreversible harm to the planet, including to some ecosystems. And then you get into extreme tipping points where we might have rapid sea level rise, coral die off, and other horrible events. So the incentive to keep to this is very high, but the political will to achieve that goal of keeping global temperatures rise below 1.5 was not achieved at this COP or at COP26.
Thank you for that context. Just to add a little bit more context before we go into the major outcomes of COP27, what were kind of the expectations leading up to COP27, the topics that were on the agenda, the goals that people or leaders were hoping to kind of achieve? What was kind of the sentiment leading into COP27?
Well, officially, definitely that we were going to have greater ambition. And it was very important for the United States, both for its credibility worldwide, as well as its contribution to reducing emissions, that the country did deliver in the Inflation Reduction Act a plan to reduce its emissions significantly by something like 45% from 2005 levels by 2030. So that was a significant offering because the United States is the world's largest historical emitter. And of course, the emissions have grown since pre-industrial times, and the world recognizes, and the analysis shows that the United States has contributed the most to that growth. And we are the second largest emitter worldwide currently. Now, we are far behind China. China is almost at 0.25% of the emissions, but we are the next in line, around 11% or so. So it was important that the United States brought forward greater ambition. Unfortunately, not many other nations brought forth greater ambition, and that was not where we wanted to be. Coming out of Glasgow, there was also an open issue regarding something called loss and damage. And that's roughly a kind of reparation. That's not really termed that, but because it's uneven who has caused climate change, it's mostly the developing world. Right now, the group of 20, the 20 nations roughly that have the largest economies, produce about 85% of emissions worldwide. So you have a lot of countries that haven't had much to do with climate change, but climate change impacts fall very unevenly across the globe. They fall very hard on tropical nations. They also fall very hard on small island nations, because with sea level rise, they lose the land. They just don't have as much territory. So there has been a concern expressed by those nations that, hey, we didn't have anything to do with this problem, but we are already seeing people die, livelihoods end, and great economic devastation. I should also note that those nations have been forced to borrow heavily from the developed world. Sometimes that borrowing often occurs in US dollars. Now with inflation and in the US dollar strength, those countries are severely impacted by debt. So, and the debt burden was added to as a result of pandemic measures. So they're struggling financially. And they came to COP26 in Glasgow saying, we want to finally elevate this issue of loss and damage, which they have been fighting for several decades. At the end of Glasgow, it didn't really get into the final agreement. It was kicked over. Nations decided to have the Glasgow dialogues over a 3-year period to continue discussion about whether there should be a mechanism for loss and damage. And I will say that the United States had taken a position that it didn't really want to agree to this because it might establish liability, because it's historically the largest emitter and currently emitting a lot. So it had really shied away from these discussions. But this year, we had some dramatic events worldwide that really brought to the fore the challenges that the developing world is facing with climate change, most notably in Pakistan. Now, Pakistan happens to had a group this year called the Group of 77, which are a number of vulnerable nations. And they decided to use that platform to continue to talk about this issue of reparations. And you'll recall that in Pakistan this year, in the early part of the year, they had devastating heat, just shriveled crops, really high temperatures. And of course, much of the nation is not air conditioned. So a lot of human suffering involved. And then the monsoons changed and they had so much flooding that a third of the nation was underwater, displacing tens of millions of people, destroying their crops. They're a major cotton exporter. The cotton crops are severely decimated. Huge damage to the nation. And the Pakistanis said, we have had nothing, almost nothing to do with creating the climate crisis, but we are paying deeply. And so they took that charge to COP27. And for the first time ever, there was, in the final agreement that gets issued after each of these annual meetings, there was a recognition that a loss and damage fund should be created. You had some developing nations, Scotland, Denmark, I believe Sweden also came forward and said, we want to be a part of the loss and damage. And then separately, there was increased pressure on the developing world coming out of COP26 and COP27 for a promise that more pressure on the developed world for a promise that the developed world made in 2009, that starting in 2020, the developed world would mobilize or make available from both private and public sources $100 billion a year to help the developing world both transition to green energy, but also for the impacts of climate change. The developed world has not yet honored that promise. And so there was greater discussion about how that will occur. And the latest estimate is that by 2023, this will finally kick into place. So at COP27, a big issue was who's going to pay for all the damage that are already occurring, which made explicit that climate change isn't a problem for the distant future. It's already happening across the globe and people are harmed. And then the question is, how do you compensate for that harm?
Thank you. So in addition to the loss and damage fund being included in the final communique, what were some other outcomes that kind of happened, or some things that didn't transpire at the meeting that people were kind of hoping for, especially in terms of mitigation, in terms of the debates and disagreements on whether to include the 1.5 temperature rise limit, any discussions about adaption, what was included in the final communique, and kind of what was left out, and what does that mean?
Well, one of the things that in the last two COPs they have really searched for is a way to discuss getting off of coal. At COP26, Alex Sharma, who was the United Kingdom's representative or the president of COP26, and he's from the United Kingdom, had said, I want to see this COP confine coal to the dustbin of history. Well, that didn't happen. The negotiations never got that agreement. It used language of phasing down fossil fuels rather than eliminating them. And it should be said that the International Energy Agency has said that as of 2023, the world should not be making any new investments, new development of fossil fuels in order to keep that 1.5 degrees alive. So that didn't get into the agreement. And what I think was clear at this COP was that a number of fossil fuel exporting nations were lobbying heavily at COP27 to keep mention of reduction or getting off of fossil fuels from gaining any strength. So the agreement coming out of COP27 out of Egypt, the Sharm el-Sheikh agreement, that's the name of the town it was held in, just repeated the language from COP26. So that was a little bit of a disappointment for proof that we are really going to move forward on reducing our emissions. And of course, next year, the COP will happen, COP28 will happen in the United Arab Emirates, also an area that's heavily dependent on fossil fuel exports. So that tension, I imagine, will continue to make itself evident as we go forward with other COPs in the future. Despite the warning from the scientists, as well as the International Energy Agency and many others, that we need to move away from fossil fuels to keep global heating contained to a level that could be safe. So that was not a success viewed from the perspective of those advocating for greater action on climate change. It really was more of a status quo agreement than we've had progress.
And sticking on this topic, so there are also African nations that call to continue to develop and monetize their natural gas resources. So there is some tension around that. And there was also concerns, with energy prices kind of being high right now, whether the technologies are there to kind of stop fossil fuel exploration right now and totally rely on renewables, especially with energy storage kind of technologies and battery technologies not being fully developed just yet. How do you think these conversations will transpire in the future? How will the developed world kind of address African nations or developing world's desires to include natural gas in the energy transition? How do you think these kind of talks and these debates will kind of unravel in the future?
Well, it's hard for the developed world to tell developing nations you can't exploit your natural resources without providing some kind of compensation to them. So that is a tremendous pressure going forward. Of course, there have to be buyers for those fossil fuels, but there probably will be among countries that don't have the natural resources. That is a sore point, and certainly it was articulated by those who were there. One thing to remember about the COP is that you have the negotiations going on. Those are from the official delegations of the nations, and that happens sort of in a separate space from everything else. And then you have a middle space where NGOs, different groups come together and have booths. So it's like a gigantic trade show, I would make it akin to. And you'll have nation booths, then you'll have booth on methane. And of course, natural gas is methane and methane reduction. So we did see increases on global pledges to reduce methane. And the reason why that is so significant is that methane doesn't last in the atmosphere, in this blanket of greenhouse gas emissions that we formed around the globe. It doesn't last as long as carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide lasts for centuries and continues to increase the rise in temperatures over a long period of time. Methane is shorter lived. I think it's about 2 decades, but during that time it's in the atmosphere, it has much greater heat forcing capabilities, about 80 times that of carbon. So the thought now is, given that carbon emissions are at the highest they've ever been, unfortunately in May in Mauna Loa, you might have read that Mauna Loa just had this terrible volcano. We've been measuring carbon emissions since 1958 in Mauna Loa. They had the highest level ever there. But we've also seen methane emissions rise dramatically in recent years. So the thought is, if we can contain the methane right now, which is, we believe, responsible for a substantial amount of the immediate heating, we can buy ourselves time. So we figure out what to do with carbon that's already in the atmosphere and buy ourselves time to continue our carbon reduction efforts. So at COP26, this methane pledge was introduced in advance of it. And now there are 150 nations that have agreed to address methane. China has indicated, it hasn't joined the pledge, but it's indicated it will also be looking at its methane emissions. And so there are these side agreements that occur in these booths and otherwise, not as part of the official negotiations, that can produce action. And then at COP26, we had a group of banks that were responsible for trillions of dollars to agree to net zero by 2050. Unfortunately, perhaps as an illustration of how difficult it is to accomplish these goals, between COP26 and COP27, a number of the banks decided, hey, wait a minute, I assume that they didn't really appreciate what they were agreeing to, and they've said, no, we can't agree to the net zero. So there was pressure on that agreement to loosen the requirements for the banks that have joined that. So it's a little 1 step forward, 2 steps back. We'll see how it goes. And then you have outside the meeting rooms, outside the negotiation, and then this big trade show, you have a lot happening in areas around the city where groups are meeting and promoting. So, for example, Saudi Arabia had a big facility promoting its green innovation efforts just outside the conference center.
Thank you for that. So going back to the loss and damage fund, as you mentioned, it was a pretty big announcement with the intent to establish it, just because for decades it's been mentioned. It's not a new thing, but developed countries were very wary about starting this. So the controversy kind of behind it, is how much money will go into the fund, who will contribute to the fund, and who will be able to take funds out. So so a couple questions, focusing on the question of who will contribute to the fund. I know there's been talk around, countries that are considered developing countries based off the 1990s definition from the UN of developing country, of China being in that, and Singapore. So what are prospects for China being someone who pays into the fund as opposed to someone who takes out of the fund? If we can't make it so that China is someone that takes out of or that contributes, do you think the developed world would still be on board for this fund? And then also any of your thoughts of how you think the fund may work out. I know the details are supposed to be kind of hammered out in the future at the next COP, but how do you think the fund may work?
So the loss and damage issue, who pays is not clear. The success of this agreement was just coming to an agreement that there would be a loss and damage fund. It's a little unclear who's going to be contributing, although it looks like the United States has signaled that it would contribute, but its our political problems here in the polarization over climate change may preclude our ability to really contribute, because it would probably take congressional authorization for us to contribute to the climate fund. And right now, President Biden has already said that he would like to give $11 billion in efforts separate from the loss and damage fund, and efforts to help the developing world with climate change. But that can't come to fruition unless Congress agrees, and it appears unlikely that Congress will agree. So there, even for the United States to be a participant, there are some significant hurdles. China is a important player in this space. Now, China in the 1990s was classified under the UN framework, or viewed under the UN framework, as a developing nation. In the decades since, things have changed significantly. It's probably the world's second largest economy. So there is interest in having China participate in the loss and damage fund. Also, because China is continuing to open new coal power plants, and China is by far the world's biggest emitter now, as I've said. China takes the position, also wants to retain that developing nation status, and it now points to the other developing nations, including the United States, as bigger emitters on a per capita basis, and that is true. So it will be an issue going forward. I can't predict whether China will come forward, but there'll certainly be a lot of pressure on China and Singapore, as you've mentioned, to provide greater contributions in the future to help the really vulnerable nations. So we'll have to see how it all plays out. But right now, China is very much resisting being pulled into this. We will continue to have challenges in getting sufficient funding. The monies that have come forward have largely gone to mitigation of emissions, that is, the cutting the level of harmful greenhouse gas emissions by the developing world. But the developing world wants a lot more money for adaptation. They do not have the kinds of levees and dams and air conditioning that the developed world has. All of those investments will better protect the developed world against climate impacts. The developing world doesn't have that, and they are clamoring for more money to address the impacts, but it's been difficult to get that kind of money. And one reason is that a lot of these projects don't have an obvious return on capital. There's just not a great way to make money off of this, whereas there is a way to make money off of creating a green energy system where you sell the energy. So it remains to be seen how all of these issues will play out. But I think in the attendees at COP, the recognition that loss and damage is finally on the agenda marks the moment where the world says climate change is hurting us, and it's hurting some people more than others, and we need to help those people. But how we deliver on those promises is really unclear. How those funds will work, not much information, and it will really rely on political dynamics within each country as to whether they contribute. And then even the handing out of the money has proven difficult in just the modest amounts that have been given to adaptation so far. There have been claims of delay in distributing the funds, and problems in that realm as well. So it's a fraught process, but it's important that it move forward, because these countries, these people are desperate for assistance. So these events just pound them. Often they don't have adequate shelter, food, resources to really be able to survive well or at all climate impacts.
Oh, sorry, let me move around in my office. My light just turned off. So, given the kind of focus from the Global South on increasing efforts towards adaptation, and also now this introduction of a loss and damage fund, do you think that, and given that this COP kind of focused less on ambitions towards mitigation targets, do you think that the focus in the future may be more on adaptation and loss and loss and damage, that might overshadow ambitions on mitigation, or mitigation might take the back seat if adaptation and loss and damage kind of moves more to the forefront in the future?
Well, my greatest fear is that as these impacts accelerate, and some of these impacts have occurred more quickly than scientists anticipated. We used to think it's off for 2100, and now, 2022, it's been devastating across the globe this year. So my greatest fear is that as these economic impacts come in, they cause severe damage to GDP globally, and some of the big European reinsurance companies have issued predictions that indeed will occur. And as we see a constriction of the global economy, as people are trying to deal with flooded homes, burnout from wildfire, increased disease spread, failed infrastructure that needs to be repaired because all of our infrastructure is built to withstand the conditions of the past, not the conditions we currently have, much less those in the future. And big surprise, they're really collapsing now on a regular basis. As that occurs across the globe, it will undermine the will and ambition to cut emissions. So at this point, it's, I believe, clear that we need to engage in both mitigation and adaptation. But adaptation has remained the poor cousin. It just doesn't get the attention that mitigation does. There are a number of reasons for that, in my opinion. One of them is mitigation, you can measure. You measure, like we do on Mauna Loa, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. And so you can set a metric for what we want to achieve, which is to reduce the amount of carbon that we're emitting, and then we can measure whether we accomplish that or not. Resilience or adaptation, there is no single metric. These impacts fall very locally. They require a lot of planning, coordination across jurisdictional boundaries. It's just harder in some ways to do, more complex, and no way to measure success. So I think mitigation, a lot of people have been attracted to it because it's not as messy as, messy is not a right word, but adaptation just has a lot of factors to consider in addition to those from mitigation. So it has suffered because of that. And I think it's suffered because there's been this perception that this is something that we have to worry about in 2100. So as we were starting to talk about climate change in the 1990s, the hope was we'll get these emissions under control and then we never really will have to adapt. So to talk about adaptation in the 1990s was to signal, wait a minute, you don't think we'll be successful on mitigation? We don't even need to talk about adaptation if we're successful in mitigation. We haven't been as successful as we hoped on mitigation, and now adaptation is somewhat taking us by surprise. If you look at the number of experts in this field, it's far fewer than those in mitigation. If you look at the amount of discussion about adaptation, it's including at the COPs, it's far lower. There just hasn't been the kind of attention that you get. And then I'll finally say, I think that we don't have the workforce that we need that understands the physical impacts of climate risk. We just don't have a widespread comprehension that climate impacts affect everything. I've mentioned that our infrastructure, we don't have building codes yet that tell us how to build climate resilient infrastructure. We don't have a cost benefit analysis that values investments in resilience to future climate impacts. So turns out those get left on the cutting room floor. We don't have a workforce that can track what are the possible impacts to the supply chain. And we've had many demonstrated already. Puerto Rico, when Hurricane Maria hit, it caused the pharmaceutical industry, which happened to have been concentrated in Puerto Rico, to really shut down. The island went 90% dark. They tried to bring generators in to help the pharmaceutical industry and the medical supply industry continue to operate, but it turned out people couldn't get to work. There was too much debris in the roads. And so we saw, for example, saline solution, the drips, the plastic bags, prices skyrocketed to by 600% because they have to be manufactured to very precise requirements. Puerto Rico couldn't do that. And then as those prices increased, hospitals turned to hypodermic needles, but those prices increased because the demand was so high. I must say, when I saw a headline, maybe 4 or 5 months ago, I don't know, from the New York Times that climate change impacts could affect supply chains, I had to say, we need to really start educating everyone. They already are impacting. And there's just not common appreciation of that yet. And that's because most people in leadership positions, including now continuingly graduates of our schools, haven't had any formal education on climate change, either in college or in graduate school. So they're learning on the fly. And how do they learn about climate change? They learn it from the news sources they read. And our news sources, unfortunately, are highly politicized as to whether climate change is a threat or whether we should be concerned, even though we have consensus reports from the International Panel on Climate Change. And I'll just add one thing about those reports. They come out, as I said, every 4 years. The executive summaries of those reports, which rest, as I said, on peer-reviewed scientific journals. They review, the scientists working on this, review the science that's come out in peer-reviewed journals, and then state, this is our consensus on where the science is. And those executive summaries, every single nation, the 197 nations who are party to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, agree to every word in those executive summaries. Those executive summaries make plain that if we go past 1.5 degrees, we are headed to calamity. But is that widely understood? No, that is not widely understood, nor is it widely understood that those same scientists tell us we have about 7 years left. And think what you were doing back in 7 years and what you project you'll be doing in 7 years, how quickly that passes. About 7 years left to cut global greenhouse gas emissions by 45%. That's a very unforgiving timeline to avoid catastrophic harm, as I mentioned. But is that widely understood? No. So one of the challenges is we don't have the workforce in place that has had the opportunity to learn about climate change, to understand how it will affect virtually everything happening and affect their own decision-making in their areas of expertise.
And for COP27, so it was kind of being called the implementation COP. Would you say that it achieved that? Any kind of real meaningful sorry, I can't even say that word right now. And what would you say is the legacy of COP27? How will people kind of remember it? Will it be something that sticks out, or will it be something that kind of, we kind of wish we could have done more? What would you say is the legacy?
Well, I think COP27 was a disappointment. It did not achieve what COP26 aimed for it to achieve. I think it has called into question the amount of time and resources spent on this international effort. There is no other alternative that has emerged, but international effort has not provided the results that are necessary to avoid very serious harm to the planet. And that has caused much more discussions post COP27 among experts as to, does this continue to be a viable way forward? And one of the risks posed by holding repeated conferences is it lulls people into thinking, oh, we're making sufficient progress because we're meeting all the time. But if you looked at the results, they have not been as ambitious as we need. There's no question that this process has bent down the curve on emissions. When scientists were first meeting it, and unabated emissions looked like we would have a 4 to 5 degrees Celsius world by 2100. We won't have that according to latest estimates. And so that is a success, no doubt about it. But it's just, the science is unforgiving that we really need to contain it much more than we are currently on track to do. What can we do to accelerate? And then the experts have raised the question, is this the right mechanism at this stage going forward? I don't have the answer to that question, but I've just been fascinated by see how much that has been articulated in weeks after COP27.
Yeah, that's a very fascinating question. Thinking about COP28, which is supposed to be held in UAE next year around this time, if you could kind of assemble that agenda for COP28, what would you put on the agenda? And also, can you talk about kind of the biggest challenges heading into COP28?
Well, number one, we have to keep the question of how are we going to cut emissions, and I think we need to have some frank discussions about some of the underlying assumptions of what we're doing. Will carbon capture and storage work? Will we be able to do that at scale? And some of the alternatives that we have. We know that there's a big push for hydrogen. I sit on the board of the Environmental Defense Fund. They have done some very interesting work that hydrogen happens to have a lot of leakage of greenhouse gas emissions, which could be highly damaging. So we need to really be looking at the solutions that are being put forward to make sure that they are solid solutions and will get us where we need to be. We also need to put adaptation, and this has been repeated for COPs for way back since at least when I started going in 2015, we need to put adaptation higher on the agenda because, as I've said, we're not prepared. And if we're not prepared, the economic damage may make us less able or willing to invest in what we need to do to cut our emissions. This issue of how do we compensate those nations who have had little to do with this in a way that helps them prepare, and also, importantly, be able to power up, to be able to have the access to the kind of energies that the developed world enjoy. So these are familiar themes. It's not as if there's something new out there that needs doing. I would add that if we want to be serious going forward with these multilateral convenings, we need to build in a way of accountability. I had several conversations with people who've been going to these COPs for a long time, and they expressed frustration. As I said, there are these side meetings and agreements being announced. It becomes very confusing. It's hard to keep track. 3 million here, 5 million here, this country's doing this, that country's doing this. And then big display of all these announcements. Everybody goes home, comes back together the next year, and there's no accountability of whether those things happened, whether they worked, whether they mattered. And so there was greater calls for some understanding of how this could all make sense, because right now it's kind of scattershot. It looks good in a press release, but it may not be accomplishing what we hope it would accomplish. And that was a refrain I heard. So I would hope that we would start talking about, what does it matter? Now, 2023 will be important because under the Paris Agreement, it's a stock-taking year. This is the year that the agreement planned for nations to come together and actually look at their progress. So I think that these issues will be on the agenda, and I hope there are some frank discussions. One of the challenges going forward has to be, what is the plan with fossil fuels? And nations have not included a real plan for how we're going to transition off of fossil fuels. That has remained an open issue, and it couldn't get into the Glasgow Agreement, couldn't get into the agreement coming out of Sharm el-Sheikh. And it couldn't get in the agreement from the G20, which, as I said, is responsible for the vast majority of emissions that came out of Bali. So if nations of the world wanted to address this, we could, but the political will has been missing so far, and perhaps COP28 can do a better job of identifying what are the levers to ensuring that we have that political will.
And one last question from me before moving to the audience. So this is kind of related to COP and not squarely about COP, but so on November 14th, the US President Biden and Chinese President Xi, they met at the G20 and they spoke about climate issues. So this meeting marked the resumption in high-level climate talks between the US and China. So I'd just like to get your thoughts on what this means for climate efforts. To what extent will this make a difference for global climate efforts?
Oh, I think it's very significant. It was most unfortunate that in the lead up to COP27, China had unilaterally said, we won't deal with the United States unless we can deal with all issues. The fact that China came back to the table is very significant. In my opinion, it's a recognition that this is a global problem. China is a major contributor, and we can't solve it unless China's at the table, and they came forward. So I think it's significant. I do know that when I was in the Obama White House, several people, including John Podesta and others, engaged in shuttle diplomacy with China to make sure that China could be a part of the historic Paris Agreement, which reached this voluntary agreement that all nations will work to reduce their emissions. And I think that kind of diplomacy between the United States and China is critical to driving future leadership across the globe. Because if China and the United States don't deliver, there's not as much as incentive for other nations to deliver. Now, the EU has emerged as a leader. It emerged as a leader during the Trump years when we saw a pull out from the Paris Agreement. The European Union stepped forward. The United Kingdom has also been a leader in its own efforts to cut emissions. So we do have a number of nations stepping forward, but it's really important that China and the United States, as two of the very major emitters, are in discussions with each other and also developing more ambitious plans to help inspire other nations to increase their efforts to cut emissions.
Great. Thank you so much, Alice, for answering my questions. That kind of concludes my Q&A portion of it.